Section 3 of the introduction to the immanence of truths is called the absolute ontological referent, which is to say V, the class of all sets, which Badiou is going to call as well the absolute. So this third section of the introduction is the qualitative presentation, or the intuitive presentation of the absolute ontological referent. And then there's another short section on the two possible modes of reading the book. And then we have a prologue, so the section on the absolute ontological referent is only about 8 pages, and after the fourth section we have a prologue of about 22 pages, which is devoted to the formal presentation of the absolute referent, or he calls it there the absolute place. So this is this is the intuitive, non-technical presentation, which is designed to motivate our taking an interest in this rather technical concept as it's developed in the mathematics of set theory. So the first subsection is called Goal and the Means of Construction of Such a Referent. Badiou goes over the structure of his book so far, because he wants everything to be perfectly clear. So he tells us that up till now he's done a first description of his general strategy, and then of the qualitative difference between finite thought and thought about the infinite. So they're the two sections that we've just been through, and the first two sections of the introduction. And now he wants to complete that description by telling us how all this is in relation with the absolute. So just to go over from this point of view in a quick summary form the first two sections. The first section concerned the general strategy, and the general strategy is we start with the absolute. So either you make the leap or you read his two other big books beforehand, and then you know why he's going to start with truths as absolute, eternal, generic, and universal. Otherwise, you say, yes, if you haven't read the books, I'm willing to make the leap because I want a way out of relativism. So, starting off with the absolute, in his general strategy, he looks at the dominant apparatus, conceptual apparatus, that we're only just coming out of, which is the ontotheological apparatus, which identifies the absolute with the one, and not just any one, not Laruelle's one, for example, but with the one conceived as totality. So the absolute, or the infinite, is identified with the one under the conditions of ontotheology, and that is somehow perpetuated in the postmodern reaction to ontotheology. For Badiou, the big change comes when Cantor develops a proof of the different sizes of infinity. There's not just one infinity, so infinity under the one. There are many different sizes of infinity. So infinity is under the sign of the multiple. So we can just stop and look at that from the schema that Laruelle gives us in Tetralogos. Laruelle says for philosophy to attain to the absolute, we have to philosophy exists in a mixture with science, already with science, but with naive and retrograde and inadequate science. So first, philosophy is in a suture or mixture, and it has to be separated out. Philosophy and science have to be separated out. A superior form of science has to be found, a more advanced stage of science, and then a new mixture, which is no longer a suture, has to be achieved. And without saying so, that is what Badiou is doing in this book and in his whole research program. The onto-theological apparatus that has dominated for 2,000 years is based on, even if it's in the background, on a suture with pre-Cantorian mathematics, as it's found in mathematics and as it's found in its use in physics. If the infinite is 1, that is in the background, in mathematical and physical terms, that is in the background one of the legitimations of ontotheology. So the process is in fact one of desuturing philosophy from a historically surpassed state of mathematics, pre-Cantorian mathematics in its concept of the infinite, and then taking us through the mathematics of the infinite to create a new mixture of philosophy and the qualitative extrapolation of this solid science, which in Badiou's case is mathematics, in Laruelle's case it's quantum theory, and in Zizek's case it's quantum theory too. So we start with the absolute, we desuture philosophy from the idea of the infinite sutured to the one, and that lets us, from the point of view of the absolute, examine the structure of finitude that we're living under. The structure of finitude, remember, the 3 hypostases. So ontological, that the finite is all that exists. The next one is a sort of politico epistemological, that because finitude is all that exists, there is a constraint on the possibles of thought and action, that we cannot create an alternative based on some infinity induced by truth procedures. And so utopias, revolutions are all imaginary, and they're not even coherent in terms of thought. So there's a constraint, a noetic constraint on the possibilities of thought. And the third constraint, or the third hypostasis, is ethical, that we must act under the authority of finitude. Badiou's reflection there is that we must confront ourselves with the hard problem, which is the ontological problem, and also that infinity really exists, and in fact the finite has no autonomous existence, or no autonomous being. It's always a construct, a product, a result. And there's also the alethic authority of truths. So we need to go back to beyond Lyotard's idea of the authority, acting under the authority of the infinite, which is ethico-political and leaves ontology for science to take care of, and for the sort of democratic process of complexification that can be extrapolated from science. And so that's Badiou's conclusion, that a mere ethico-political authority of the infinite is going to be insufficient. It's going to be inadequate philosophically, conceptually, and it's going to be inadequate confronted with the actual development of capitalist society. Is going to lead to a form of a reaction. In Lyotard's case, the reaction is just fusing, conflating the idea of the infinite with its existence in the artistic truth procedure, and where it manifests itself in the sublime, and in the political truth procedure, where Lyotard gives primacy to the ethical part of the political truth procedure, and inside the ethical sub procedure, he conflates or sutures that to a notion of the law with a capital L. But in fact, the conclusion is pessimistic in Lyotard's case, because yes, there is complexification, and that is inevitable for Lyotard, but it's insufficient. So we need to listen to the different, the incommensurables that find no echo in the ongoing complexification of the physical and social world. But as soon as we listen to these differends, we absorb them back into the ongoing process of complexification. So the problem there is that there is no questioning of this ongoing process of complexification that can radically change things. The questioning that we can do is going to be constantly reabsorbed. So the hard problem is to show that inside this imminent ongoing process of complexification, there are the interventions of truths and truth procedures that are subtended by different sorts of infinity. In the second part, following up that critique of finitude and the need for a more robust concept of the authority of the infinite going up or down to the ontological level, Badiou takes us through the difference between demonstration and a thought based on finite cases, and thought and demonstration based on infinite cases. The case or study that he takes is the power set theorem, that the power set the set of all the possible subsets of a set is always of a higher number, a higher cardinality than the set itself. And he just goes through that to show us how reasoning on the infinite case is different, but he does show us this actual reasoning. So we've already got not just a declaration of different sizes of infinity, we have a mathematical proof of how to construct higher infinites. We just take the power set of an infinite set, and we've got a new infinite set of a higher level or magnitude of infinity. So there is already the mathematical underpinning that has been developed, at least in this specific theorem. Badiou then goes on, after this reminder, to tell us that the problem today is no longer ontotheology, but contemporary materialism, which aims always at having a democratic consensus around freedom of opinion and expression. So it's a democratic consensus as to the perpetual existence and positive value of dissensus, which is a paradoxical concept in itself. It's the relativist consensus. So everybody agrees on the need to disagree as much as possible. And that ultimately is a form of skepticism, and it's based around the idea that no truths, in the absolute sense of truth, no truths are possible. And that's the doxa of finitude. So Badiou says that his speculative strategy must nourish in a rational manner the conviction that the emancipating element of truths is to a large degree tied in with the texture of crossed infinities. So truth, as he said, is based on the rubbing together or the crossing together of two infinities of different sizes. And that's what makes possible the existence of truths in works and no longer their repression in waste products. And further, the intelligibility of this action of the infinite supposes that we accept that it traces in the worlds, the immanent worlds, the mundane immanence, a sort of touch of the absolute. So that means that there will always be points within the finite, the conceptual reality of finitude. There will always be points that are indicators of the being touched by the absolute, and so referring us back to the absolute. Badiou talks about philosophical progressism, so it's not progress, but progressism, and he isolates or analyzes two orientations. One is subjective totalization, and that's the orientation deployed by Sartre. And then in part autonomously, in part as a reaction to this subjective totalization, we have the positivist or scientistic or structuralist orientation. And Badiou has a little aside where he includes Deleuze in that, in terms of a vitalist positivism. I think he's mistaken there, and says that on this orientation, it still presupposes a totality of some sort. Another example that he gives is the positivism of drives, which Badiou claims that Lacan falls into, and that Zizek flirts with. So Zizek, sometimes he's in the right third orientation, which he hasn't said again in his paragraph, and sometimes he falls back into the basically structuralist positivist orientation in one of its forms, in the Lacanian form, which is the structuralist positivism of the drives. Badiou goes on to say that of the five great philosophers, Sartre, Althusser, Deleuze, Lacan, and Zizek, and he adds one more without false modesty, himself, who between 1940 and today have proposed that thought in its very principle is linked to knowledge, sciences, experiences, practices, political practices, and works of art of their time, and which search therein without any resort to dead gods or established laws, whatever resources that can be obtained in favor of a subjective emancipation. And so they've produced uncountable concepts, figures, or propositions that we can retain, even if we can't retain the systems of these thinkers. We can retain all this conceptual creation as a common work and common resource for further works. So that's an interesting list: Sartre, Althusser, Deleuze, Lacan, and Zizek. I would put Laruelle in there as well, and it's very Franco-French oriented. I would also put Robert Brandom amongst the living there, amongst the mighty dead, to use Brandom's expression. People have come up with convincing arguments to include Wilfrid Sellers. I would include Feyerabend on the condition that we learn to read Feyerabend correctly, which is far from the case today. So I would also add Bruno Latour, who has a strange relation to philosophy, but has pushed the thinking on these sorts of things that are shared by the other thinkers, using the resources of science, in his case, the fabrication of law, of art, and eco-politics. So that will be another singular philosophical creator, maybe Sloterdijk as well. So it's not necessarily a closed list, but that's the list of influences that Badiou is in fact empirically influenced by and conceptually most comfortable with. And that's what he says in their favor, aside from a certain tendency to positivism in Zizek, and a tendency to Lacan, and a tendency to totalization in Sartre and Deleuze. Nevertheless, they haven't really paid attention enough to the classical lessons that can come from their philosophical ancestors. So Plato, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Husserl, just to take the most irrefutable references, have all said explicitly that without mathematics, philosophy is blind. So he's putting, as we've already seen, a lot of weight on the mathematical condition. But he himself says that the mathematical, that is the scientific condition or truth procedure, is, in another sense, at an equal level in terms of deploying the absolute, deploying infinity. Mathematics is on an equal level with the three other truth procedures. So one could also say that it's perhaps a little unjust, whatever Badiou thinks of Deleuze's use of mathematics. Deleuze does think in close connection with mathematics, especially in difference and repetition, and in the wake of difference and repetition. So even if it's the differential calculus and not set theory, that's a point of detail and discussion. The fact is that Deleuze developed his thought in close contact with and confrontation with and dialogue with the sciences, arts, politics, and subjective innovations in love and desire of his time. So I think he's being a little unfair to Deleuze there. Lacan alone gave himself the means of listening to this warning that we can't neglect mathematics, but symmetrically he didn't care about politics. So I don't think, despite Lacan's talk about and use of the matheme, I don't think that and of topology, I don't think that it is of the same order of engagement in the concrete detail that Deleuze has. If we wanted a continuum, I'm perfectly willing to put Badiou at the mathematical end of, at the high degree of confrontation with mathematics, but I would say on the continuum, Laruelle exists, perhaps here. So Lacan certainly confronts mathematics, but he's, for me, on the low end of the continuum. Laruelle confronts, above all, quantum mechanics, but he also confronts mathematics in a way that is a little more detailed than Lacan. Deleuze is a lot more developed in his confrontation with an assimilation of mathematics and extrapolation of concepts and conceptual creation via mathematics. And okay, Badiou is at the top, but I think he's making a mistake in terms of the relative placing of Lacan and Deleuze on that continuum. So, are you concerned with the politics? He seems to suggest that Sartre and Deleuze and Althusser, maybe Zizek? I don't know. He's making an exception for Zizek. So, either you're concerned with the politics and the subjectivation, and you neglect the mathematics, or in the case of Lacan, you concern yourself with the mathematics and you neglect the politics. I think the conceptual typology is interesting. We can imagine other cases of combinations of the 4 truth procedures and which ones you privilege and which ones you neglect. But his particular cases that he puts in these 2 different types open to discussion. We might not want to agree with him there. Badiou says that the most important, or I suppose the just strategically most important diagonal goes from mathematics to politics, or mathematics to politics, or mathematics to politics. Maybe it's all on one immanent plane. And that's what Plato saw as this diagonal between mathematics and politics is Plato's resource for drawing an answer to the question, what is a life worthy of the name? So in fact, despite all the mathematical apparatus in this book, The Immanence of Truths, it's a book about the true life, the good life, the happy life. It's a book about, Badiou says at one point, in one of his lectures, it's a book about coming out of the cavern and the cavern is finitude and oppression. So coming out of the cavern and having the experience in one or more truth procedures of the absolute and of the infinities within this life. And that's the principle of the good life and the happy life. So to make that possible today, we need a robust ontology coming from a confrontation with the best of the concepts that mathematics has to offer us today. And Badiou tells us that here our admirable philosophers, the ones he's listed, have missed 3 crucial concepts in that modern mathematics proposes to anyone who is interested in non-constrained and unlimited ontology. So a general ontology, special relativity in French is relativité restreinte, and general relativity is relativité générale. So his use of restraint there, or non-restrained means an ontology that is like general relativity compared and contrasted with special relativity. So if we want a general ontology capable of receiving the infinitude of truths, there are these three concepts from mathematics that are the richest in absoluteness. That's the generic set, which founds all thought of the universal, the concept of the sheaves in mathematics, which proposes logic of worlds, and finally the concept of a very large infinity, which, as an immanent approximation to the absolute, is the one that's going to occupy us in this book. So generic set is a callback to being an event. The concept of the sheaf is a callback to logics of worlds. They're key concepts that haven't been exploited by any other philosopher except himself at this general speculative level of ontology. And so we have to establish the consequences, the speculative concepts, the speculative consequences of this concept, of the very large infinite. And already it leads us to have done with Stoic resignation, which he claims is a subjectivity that is adequate to finitude. So we've seen today on the rise a sort of popularized version of Stoicism on the model of the type of positive psychology to set you free, and I think it's very interesting, this new Stoicism that has cropped up. But according to Badiou, it has a fatal flaw, and that is this passivity with respect to the finite, and this ignorance of the infinite. So Badiou claims that there are two depressing maxims of Stoicism. One, do not occupy yourself with things that do not depend on you. So there are things under your control and things outside your control. So Stoicism recommends, in fact, a shrinking of your zone of concern to the things that are under your control. Badiou says that, in fact, in truth, if I have at my disposition an infinite resource, it is these things outside my official finitely imposed control that I must take care of in order to be free. So capitalism is, under its neoliberal variant even more so, constantly shrinking the domain of our concern. More and more things are just not dependent on us, nothing we can do about it, and so we should shrink our concerns down to the smallest possible territory. The second maxim, he gets, well, the first one he cites Seneca, but it's a general Stoic maxim. The second one, he cites Wittgenstein, what one cannot talk of, well, I'm translating from the French, whereof one cannot talk, thereof one must be silent, in one of the translations of Wittgenstein. And Badiou says, in truth, he's saying in truth, you could almost say, verily, verily I say unto you, verily I say unto Wittgenstein, that it's when everybody agrees that it's impossible to talk about something that I must begin to speak, and in order to be free. So I think he may be taking Wittgenstein a little too literally, because Wittgenstein did write a book with the conclusion that what you cannot talk about you must pass over in silence, which is a paradoxical object in Anglophone analytic philosophy. And Wittgenstein did go on to say lots of things. In the lecture on ethics, he says that he has the impression that if he could say anything about ethics, it would explode every other book based on facts and objectivity, so on finitude. But then he does go on in semi-poetic way, because it's not just poetic. He goes on to discuss ethical experiences. So he doesn't respect this prohibition of finitude. In fact, the finitude forbids us from talking about infinite things. Something that positivism tried to reinforce with this idea of the verifiability principle. And Wittgenstein, although supposedly the source of that from some free-form remarks he made, always rejected the verifiability principle. So Badiou claims that what mathematics makes possible is that it offers, insofar as it's a speculative resource, it offers itself to the philosopher who wants to go beyond the forms of oppression of his time. And that's what he calls the possibility of an absolute ontology, inside which can be organized a dialectic between the finite and the infinite, as creation and absorption of the finite by the infinite. So he's putting a lot on this idea, not just that mathematics creates new concepts for us and contains multiple infinities and a thought of the absolute. In this list of generic sets, sheaves, and very large infinites, there is a fourth concept which is absolutely vital importance, and that is the absolute. And that is the one, relying on the three others, that is the one that gets us out of the relativist dilemma as set up by Kant. So he calls this an absolute ontology, which posits the existence of a universe of reference, So that's the absolute referent. It's a universe of reference where the thought of being qua being finds its place. So here he's going to list 4 characteristics of this absolute ontology. I'm going to spoil things. As I said, this is section 3 of the introduction. He develops the idea of an absolute ontology, and this is subsection 1, and in subsection 2 he's going to come back to these characteristics, these 4 characteristics, and he's going to say that set theory conforms to these 4 requirements, or these 4 characteristics. If we want an absolute ontology, which is the only way out from relativism that Badiou sees, and as well a way out that is supported by drawing on mathematics as a speculative resource. The absolute ontology must be immobile, in the sense that making the thought of movement possible, as any rational thought must do, it is nevertheless foreign to this category, to movement. So that's the idea, that an absolute ontology must be immobile, because if it's taken itself in movement, if it's mobile, it's caught within relativism. It's caught within universal variation, and cannot oppose anything, because to this variation of opinions and of ways of doing things as all equally valid, because it itself would be taken up in the movement and the circulation and the variability. So the absolute ontology, if we're going to escape relativism, so far he's just deducing the conditions for an absolute ontology, and then he'll say that these conditions are realized by set theory. So it must be immobile. It must be integrally intelligible in its being on the basis of nothing. Or, in other words, there must be no entity from which it is composed. Or, in other words, it's non-atomic. So here the idea is an absolute ontology has no component parts, because then they would be even more absolute than the absolute referent, which will be derived instead of primary. So he's pinning a lot on this idea that if it's absolute, it's primary, and so it can't be decomposed into component elements. It's non-atomic. The third characteristic is that it can be described or thought only in terms of axioms or principles. More particularly, this is an anti-empiricist criterion. There exists no experience or any construction which depends on an experience that can produce it. It is radically non-empirical. So that's a fairly obvious one in the principle. It's non-atomic in terms of components, and it's logically underivable as well. It's an absolute leap, as we've been saying. I call it a leap, but it's an axiomatic positing of hypotheses. Afterwards, you can test the hypotheses by way of drawing conclusions and comparing that with whatever you've got to compare it with, experience in the broadest sense. But there's no way of deriving this absolute and this absolute ontology from experience. Experience is already pre-constituted by all sorts of assumptions and doesn't have the logical nature from which an absolute generality or universality can be deduced. So it's axiomatic in that sense. And fourthly, it obeys a principle of maximality in the sense that everything that can be deduced from it without contradiction is contained within it. It prescribes the existence of everything that can be deduced from it. So that's the idea, once again, that as absolute, it just goes to its ultimate consequences, and no outside influence can constrain or limit or stop the generation without contradiction of consequences. It's an ongoing process, so it's describable in terms of this principle of maximality. It's not subject to reductionism. You can't sort of say some of the conclusions are the basis for everything, and it's not based on Occam's razor, where I suppose to a certain extent limited in the number of axioms that we posit. We don't want axioms that have no use, or axioms that can be derived from others, in which case why call them axioms. But aside from that sort of general recommendation as to how to set up a set of axioms, there's no trying to avoid the entities that we can conclude from these axioms, saying no, we don't want to go that far, we need to add a principle to cut that down, as with Occam's razor. It's to go to its maximal set, if it's a set, it's maximal degree of ontological consequences. So Badiou says, which is a little confounding, this place, this absolute place, escapes from the distinction between being and thought, since it is the place where a thought of being exists. And then he says we can formulate that in terms of Parmenides' maxim, the same is thought and being. So it's not physical in the sense of the laws of physics, but it's a noetic place whose actual status is up for grabs for the moment. But he's going to say that it can't be a set. It must be, if it's anything, a class. So its existence is dictated by thought, and thought and being coincide in this place. What it thinks is, but what it thinks is sets. So there's no idealism in that assertion. Badiou goes on to take up an intellectual influence, perhaps, but ally in Spinoza. He says that Spinoza is the first thinker to have affirmed coherent materialism as requiring an absolute referential. He quotes Theorem 28 from Book 1 of the Ethics, which you can look up, because he doesn't quote the crucial part, which is in the proof. He quotes the theorem, which says everything is determined by causally by something else, and so on to infinity. So that guarantees determinism as in particular necessary for any rational mechanics. But in the part that he doesn't quote, that Badiou doesn't quote, the proof, Badiou tells us that in the demonstration for Theorem 28, it requires that we know properties of singular existence which are not finite, and that these properties are established in Theorems 21, 22, or 23. And these properties of non-finite singular existence or beings or entities, these properties depend immediately on the fundamental properties of God or substance, which is the name that Spinoza gives to the absolute referential or referent. In other words, the rational knowledge of even the least finite movement requires the ontological guarantee of substance, with a capital S, also called God or nature. And the construction of this guarantee puts into play, in a crucial way, the difference between the finite and the infinite. So this constant comparison and contrast with Spinoza will crop up regularly inside the book, and one could say that to a certain extent it's an indirect way of establishing the comparison and the contrast with Deleuze, something that he does directly as well, but also indirectly by talking about Spinoza. So Badiou says that he agrees with Spinoza on two essential points: that the slightest, the thought of the slightest local change implies the existence of an absolute frame of reference, and another way of saying that is every physics requires an invariant, a mathematical invariant. Or, more generally, thinking a mundane singularity, one that is immanent in the world, supposes a trans world immanent frame of reference or referent. So that comes back to the identity, not the identity so much as the essential characteristics of truths. We said that the eternity of a truth is not existing for all time, both before and after. Truths are created in the world by processes that occur immanently within the world, but they are not confined to that world. They're trans world, So they're both immanent in worlds and transworld. They're a resource to be drawn on in radically different worlds. Also in radically similar worlds, but that's not surprising, in radically different worlds. So that's the first thing that he shares with Spinoza, that even the smallest thing and movement requires an absolute referent. The second one is a question of the infinite, and one way of stating that is the mathematical invariant is, first of all, a thought of the infinite or of infinites as such. So this mathematical invariant, we said it's invariant because it's immobile. That's one of the first requirements. That's the first requirement that Badiou puts up for the intelligibility of and the effectiveness of this notion of the absolute referent. It must be immobile if it's to be any good, if it's going to be absolute, and if it's going to be any good against relativism. It itself must be subtracted from movement and change, so invariant, but everything that deals with movement and change must refer back to it. Badiou goes on to say that he diverges from Spinoza in a single point. The absolute referential cannot be in the form of the one. So he's taking on there a key doctrine in Deleuze's philosophy, and that he attributes to Spinoza, the univocity of the one, the univocity of being. So he says the absolute referential or frame of reference cannot be the infinite expression of a single eternal essence. He quotes from the Ethics, definition 6 of book 1. By God I understand an absolutely infinite entity, that is to say, substance consisting in an infinity of attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence. So Badiou deduces from this definition that the infinite has a double implication. It concerns the number of attributes of God, so it's approached in the mode of quantity, and it concerns the existential intensity of the existence of God, and so it comes under the mode of quality. And according to Badiou, this hesitation, or this combination of quantity and quality, gives us an ambivalence of the infinite. But nonetheless, it's strictly oriented towards the supremacy of the one. And he quotes the vast movement which goes from proposition 1 to proposition 14, and the definition of God that occurs in this vast movement. Aside from God, there cannot be nor be conceived any substance. So for Spinoza, God is the immanent frame of reference for all materialism. And so, to cut things short, this is not acceptable for Badiou, because by thinking God under the form of the one, you're you're pre-Cantorian. You're cutting out the possibility of different sizes of infinity, and you're opening up as a replacement concept for transcendence. You're placing totality. So for Badiou, the task of contemporary thought is to maintain the objective of Spinoza, that is, the ontological guarantee that is both immanent and absolute of a possible science of any local movements or changes. So you need to maintain an ontological guarantee of an infinite science of finite works, which means a comprehension of the finite without finitude. So you need an infinitized, because it appeals to truths and to the different infinities of the finite. That's what we implicitly get in Spinoza, implicitly, because it's fused with another requirement that Badiou wants to abandon, that is the monotheistic form, or we could say in fact the monistic form of this guarantee that subsumes everything under the power of the one. So he makes a little joke, we would have to renounce God without losing any of his advantages. So we must find an ontological, an absolute and immanent ontological guarantee, which has gone over entirely to the side of the multiple as such. And so for the moment, it's on the side of the one, this ontological guarantee, but we need to switch it over to the side of the multiple and to preserve the four crucial principles that are immobility, composition on the basis of nothing, axiomatic disposition, and the principle of maximality.